So we've already talked about the early onset of the Cold War because of alliance systems like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The growing fear of communism leads the US government to trend towards a policy known as containment. Containment is really aimed at keeping communism contained to the places where it exists. As communism begins to grow in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it leads the United States to become more and more uncomfortable. It leads to hot wars in places like Korea. A communist revolution in China in 1949 brings Mao Zedong to power in China. Now, this is a little surprising to the world and to the US government because China had helped the Allied powers resist the Japanese Empire throughout World War II. However, it really was just a pause in a longer civil war going on between Mao Zedong's Communist Army and the government that existed in China prior to Japan conquering during World War II. Once the war is over, however, Mao resumes his quest to communize China. In 1949, Mao is successful. His armies drive Xing Jieshi and the rest of the Chinese government leadership out of China for good, and China is at this point communist. Here is a propaganda painting of the Chinese Communist Party promoting Mao Zedong as leader and promoting his Little Red Book, which was kind of the Chinese Communist handbook. When the Soviets go nuclear in 1949, this also raises tension. Notice this is the same year that China goes communist. There is a lot to be afraid of in the year 1949. By 1952, the U.S. had created a bomb 1,000 times more destructive than the A-bomb. The hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb for short, started the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Korean War. Because of fears of communism, you're bound to run into an actual violent conflict and not just tension between the two sides. The Japanese were driven out of Korea by both the Soviet Union and the United States towards the end of World War II. At Yalta and Potsdam, it had been agreed upon that North Korea would be communist and South Korea democratic, and that they would be divided at the 38th parallel. This was supposed to solve the tension issue right from the get-go. Unfortunately, in 1949, U.S. troops leave South Korea, and in June 1950, a North Korean army marches across the 38th parallel and invades South Korea. As you can see from this map, South Korea was on the verge of being overrun before President Truman and the United Nations wasted no time in sending troops to defend South Korea. War was never declared, however. Harry Truman referred to U.S. involvement as a police action, which is really kind of a dangerous term to use and a dangerous trend to set because ever since World War II, the United States has never declared another war, even though it has fought numerous wars. So the term police action really opens the door for the United States to be involved militarily around the world without actually having declared war on anybody. General Douglas MacArthur, who made himself famous in the Pacific Campaign of World War II, suffered some defeats at first, but manages to turn the tide and push the North Koreans back to the Chinese border, which is the Yalu River. His success causes China to panic and defend North Korea, counterattacking. They crossed the Yalu River and pushed UN and US troops, mainly US troops, back into South Korea. You can see a map here in which they've pushed back beyond the 38th parallel boundary again. A lot of back and forth fighting, but in the last year and a half or so of the Korean War, there really wasn't a lot of movement of the front lines. There was just a lot of attacks against those front lines with mounting casualties on both sides. MacArthur wanted authority to bomb Chinese military bases in Manchuria to prevent them from attacking his troops in battle. President Truman denied him the authority to do so because he was afraid it would turn into a larger scale war with China or maybe even the Soviet Union. When MacArthur criticized Truman for his decision publicly, he is removed from command. You cannot, as a general in the armed forces, criticize your commander-in-chief. However, Truman loses popularity. The American public really kind of sides with General MacArthur. Truman is blamed for allowing China to become a communist nation in general, and he's even more unpopular for removing the very popular General MacArthur from his command. Lastly, accusations that communists had infiltrated the U.S. government, including Truman's cabinet, made his approval ratings absolutely plummet, and as a result, Republican Dwight Eisenhower is overwhelmingly elected president in 1952 due to fears that the Democratic Party had been infiltrated by communists. This growing fear of communism leads to another Red Scare similar to the one we learned about at the end of World War I, which had followed the Russian Revolution of 1917. Back then, you saw the federal government throwing people in prison for possibly being communist, and just a general fear of communism. That dies down a little bit, but after the onset of the Cold War, it grows again. The Hiss case in 1948 involved Albert Hiss, a member of FDR's State Department, who had been convicted of committing perjury over accusations of giving secret government documents to the Soviets. So, Albert Hiss is feared to have been a communist spy within FDR's State Department. The Rosenberg case in 1950. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are convicted and executed in 1953 for giving the Soviet Union information about U.S. nuclear weapons development programs. So there is a lot going on overseas that causes tension, and there's a lot going on here at home that's causing tension and an ever-increasing Red Scare, which leads to the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, accused political leaders as well as civilians of being communists or communist sympathizers. I put that in quotes because someone who would simply speak out and say, you can't just randomly throw someone in prison just because you suspect they might be a communist. That's speaking up for that person's civil rights and civil liberties, yet McCarthy would say, well, that makes you a communist sympathizer. And that person might find themselves in jail or under scrutiny of some kind. This ruined the careers of many politicians, actors, writers, and educators. When he attempted to accuse members of the U.S. Army, the hearings were televised for the first time. And when the American people finally saw just how badly he bullied and harassed people on the stand, he lost influence very quickly. And in 1954, the Senate actually voted to censure, which is called officially criticizing, publicly criticizing McCarthy for his actions, and he loses a lot of influence moving forward. One last thing that has little to do with growing fear of communism or the Red Scare, but is a trend towards the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, is to prevent unemployment among the men returning home from war. The GI Bill was passed. And this really it gave money for higher education for soldiers. So it really gave a lot of opportunities for soldiers to either improve from a job that they weren't totally happy with, or if they were unlucky enough to be unemployed when they returned from war, to go back to school to really make a great career for themselves. This is the end of the presentation. Please go back to the website and take the online quiz associated with these notes. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.